In the end, every form of betrayal, disconnection, or emotional pain we face in relationships is a mirror reflecting the parts of ourselves we have yet to fully own, honor, or protect. Whether it's the projection of idealism, suppressed boundaries, shadow relationships, misalignment of values, fear of confrontation, or dependency tied to self-abandonment. Each dynamic stems from a deeper story we carry about our worth, our needs, and our place in connection with others. The truth is, betrayal doesn't just come from others. It often begins when we betray ourselves in the name of love, peace, or belonging. But within that painful realization lies the most powerful opportunity to return to ourselves. To confront the uncomfortable, to speak the unspoken, to stop shrinking, to fit into spaces that require our silence. Growth begins the moment we stop outsourcing our value and start embodying our truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it risks loss. You do not need to be everything for everyone. You only need to be fully yourself, and in doing so, you will naturally align with the people, values, and love that are meant for you. Healing isn't about fixing who you are. It's about remembering who you were before fear made you forget. And when you return to that place, betrayal loses its power, and you begin to build a life anchored in self-respect, clarity, and unshakable inner alignment. It rips through trust, shakes your sense of reality, and leaves you wondering, how could they do this to me? But the painful truth is, betrayal doesn't come from nowhere. It often begins with the subtle ways we abandon ourselves. We ignore red flags. Projection of idealism is one of the most common yet least understood psychological patterns that shape human relationships. It operates quietly, often unconsciously, influencing how we perceive others and why we sometimes end up deeply hurt or disillusioned. When someone enters our life, whether as a friend, a romantic partner, mentor, or even just an acquaintance, we don't always see them for who they truly are. Instead, we see them through a lens colored by our own desires, needs, memories, and unresolved emotions. This lens is what we call projection. And when it's driven by idealism, it sets the stage for emotional distortion. At its core, idealism is the tendency to believe in or pursue noble ideals and perfection, especially in people or situations. While it can be beautiful, offering hope, optimism, and a belief in the good, it becomes dangerous when applied uncritically to individuals. Idealistic projection involves placing your internal idea of the perfect person onto someone else. You don't just see them as they are, you see them as a savior, a soulmate, a missing puzzle piece, a hero, or the answer to your pain. This happens subtly and usually without any conscious decision. You might be drawn to someone who simply smiles a certain way or says something kind, and your mind starts writing a story. This person gets me. They would never hurt me, but they're different from everyone else. None of these thoughts are based on actual lived experience with a person. They are projections. These projections are often shaped by your inner emotional landscape. For example, if you grew up feeling abandoned, you might project security and emotional safety onto someone who gives you even the smallest bit of attention. If you've longed for validation, you might idealize someone who compliments you. This person, in reality, might not have the emotional intelligence or depth to offer true connection, but because of what they represent to you, your mind fills in the blanks with everything you wish they were. What makes projection of idealism so compelling is that it bypasses logic. It's not about what you know intellectually, it's about what you feel. Emotional needs, when unmet, have a powerful influence over perception. The deeper the need, the stronger the projection. And the more intense the projection, the greater the disappointment when reality eventually asserts itself. Because at some point it always does. No one can sustain an illusion forever, not even unintentionally. When the cracks begin to show, you might feel betrayed, disillusioned, or even angry. But the root of the pain is often not the person's actions. It's the collapse of the image you created. Idealistic projection can also lead to repeated patterns in relationships. People often find themselves falling for the same kind of person over and over, not realizing they are chasing a symbol rather than a person. This is where idealism becomes a loop. You meet someone new, feel the spark, imagine the potential, and dive in with hope. Then slowly things unravel. You see that they are flawed, human, perhaps even harmful. The pedestal you place them on crumbles, And yet in time the cycle begins again with someone else. This happens not because you are foolish, but because your unconscious mind is still seeking something it has not yet healed or integrated. Another side effect of projecting idealism is emotional dependency. When you believe someone else holds the key to your happiness, worth, or purpose, you give away your power. You make them the source of your joy, meaning, and self-esteem. That's an enormous weight for any relationship. Over time, this can lead to disappointment not just for you, but for the other person as well. They may sense your expectations, feel pressure to live up to them, or eventually pull away when they realize they cannot be who you want them to be. Often this withdrawal feels like betrayal. But in truth, it is not always about deceit. It's about the dissonance between projection and reality. What's particularly painful is how this dynamic often starts with innocence. Idealistic projection is usually not malicious. It comes from hope, from a yearning to connect, to heal, to believe in something bigger than yourself. People want to believe in love, friendship, loyalty, and magic. But these things, when forced onto someone who has not truly earned that space, become illusions. You might give your trust energy and vulnerability too soon. You might overlook red flags or minimize issues, and in doing so, you betray yourself long before anyone else does. Projection is not limited to romantic relationships either. It happens in friendships, families, work environments, and even with public figures. We project idealism onto teachers, celebrities, spiritual leaders, and anyone who seems to embody something we value or lack within ourselves. That's why scandals involving admired figures can feel so devastating. They don't just destroy reputations, they shatter personal beliefs and identities built around those projections. To understand and break free from the cycle of projection, you have to start within. It requires radical self-awareness. Ask yourself, what am I looking for in this person that I haven't yet found in myself? Or what parts of me are hungry for recognition, love, or safety? Am I seeing them clearly, or am I seeing a story I've created? These questions are not meant to induce guilt. They're meant to bring clarity, because once you become aware of your projections, you can begin to reclaim the power you've handed to others. It's also helpful to practice ground. That means slowing down your attachment process and observing someone over time before assigning them deep emotional significance. Pay attention to how they handle conflict, how they respond to your boundaries, how they behave when no one is watching. Look for patterns, not promises. People reveal themselves slowly, and if you allow space for truth instead of rushing into fantasy, you give yourself a better chance of real, honest connection. Ultimately, projection of idealism is a deeply human experience. We all do it to some degree. But when you become conscious of it, you begin to love people for who they are, not who you wish they were. And more importantly, you stop outsourcing your worth to people who were never meant to carry it in the first place. Suppressed boundaries are one of the most overlooked causes of emotional pain, exhaustion, and betrayal in human relationships. Boundaries are not walls meant to keep people out. They are the lines that define where you end and another person begins. They protect your time, energy, emotions, and personal integrity. But when boundaries are not expressed, or worse, when they are constantly suppressed, the result is not connection. It's quiet resentment, disempowerment, and eventually a rupture that could have been avoided. From early childhood, many people are conditioned to believe that being agreeable, polite, or self-sacrificing makes them good or lovable. This belief often develops in environments where expressing needs is discouraged or punished. For instance, a child who is scolded for saying a no may grow into an adult who cannot comfortably assert themselves. They may fear that setting boundaries will lead to rejection, conflict, or abandonment. So instead, they smile through discomfort, tolerate things that hurt them, and keep silent when something feels wrong. Suppressing boundaries often feels safer than the perceived risk of being honest. The danger lies in the accumulation. One suppressed boundary might seem insignificant. A skipped comment, an ignored gut feeling, a smile when you wanted to speak up. But over time, each act of self-betrayal adds weight to your emotional world. You may start to feel anxious, frustrated, or drained without understanding why. The people around you may think everything is fine because you haven't said otherwise, but inside you're screaming. This dissonance between your inner truth and outer behavior creates emotional leakage. Small bursts of passive aggression, withdrawal, or eventually explosive confrontations that seem to come out of nowhere. Suppressed boundaries are especially prevalent in relationships where there is a strong power dynamic or emotional dependency. You might fear losing someone, so you allow behaviors that make you feel small or disrespected. You might crave approval so much that you say yes to things that cost you your peace. You may feel responsible for someone else's feelings and thus avoid doing what's best for you. This pattern leads to emotional overextension. You're constantly giving, yet but not from a place of abundance. You give to keep the peace, to avoid discomfort, or to maintain an illusion of harmony. But true harmony cannot exist without honesty. One of the most painful consequences of suppressed boundaries is how it erodes your sense of self. Over time, you might begin to forget what you actually want or need because you've trained yourself to focus on others. You may second-guess your feelings or invalidate your discomfort because you've normalized self-neglect. People may even come to expect your silence or compliance, not because they are malicious, but because you've taught them, consciously or not, that your needs are negotiable. This creates a cycle where you feel increasingly invisible, and they become increasingly unaware of the damage being done. Ironically, people who suppress their boundaries often pride themselves on being kind, generous, or easygoing. But there's a hidden cost. Kindness without boundaries becomes martyrdom. Generosity without limits breeds resentment. And being easygoing without expressing your truth turns to chronic dissatisfaction. There's nothing noble about self-sacrifice if it's rooted in fear. True kindness includes honesty. True generosity includes discernment. And true love includes self-respect. In many cases, people who suppress boundaries do so because they confuse them with rejection. They believe that saying a no is unkind or that asking for space is selfish. But boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about honoring yourself. They are the way you teach others how to treat you. When communicated clearly and calmly, boundaries don't push people away. They filter the ones who cannot meet you and respect. And those who genuinely care for you will not be threatened by your boundaries. They will appreciate the clarity. Another common misconception is that boundaries must be aggressive or confrontational. In reality, the most effective boundaries are often expressed with calm firmness. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to explain yourself endlessly. A simple "I'm not comfortable with that" or "I need time to think" is enough. The challenge lies not in the words themselves, but in the emotional courage it takes to say them. It requires breaking patterns of people, pleasing, and reclaiming the belief that your needs matter just as much as anyone else's. Suppressing boundaries doesn't only affect relationships with others, it also distorts the relationship you have with you. Every time you ignore your intuition, you teach yourself not to trust it. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you erode your self-integrity. And every time you stay silent when something hurts, you reinforce the belief that your voice doesn't. Over time, this can lead to anxiety, burnout, depression, or a profound sense of emptiness. You start to feel like a guest in your own life, always adjusting to others, never quite centered in yourself. Healing from suppressed boundaries starts with awareness. Begin by noticing the moments where you feel a twinge of resentment or discomfort. Those are usually clues that a boundary was ignored. Reflect on the people or situations where you tend to stay silent. Ask yourself what you're afraid will happen if you speak your truth. Often, the imagined consequences are far worse than reality. In fact, asserting boundaries often leads to greater respect, deeper connection, and a stronger sense of self. The process is not easy, especially if you've spent years or decades minimizing your needs. But each small act of boundary setting builds your emotional foundation. It teaches you that it's okay to take up space, that it's okay to be misunderstood, that you are not responsible for how others react to your truth. With time, you learn to tolerate the discomfort of growth more than the pain of self-betrayal. You also begin to attract different kinds of people. Those who respect your clarity, who honor your time, who listen when you speak. These relationships don't drain you, they nourish. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust yourself again. You know when something feels off, and you know you have the right to respond. You no longer live in quiet fear of upsetting others because you've learned that your peace is not up for negotiation. Suppressed boundaries may feel like a form of love or loyalty in the moment, but over time they cost you far more than they give. The more you suppress, the more you lose pieces of yourself. But every time you choose truth over silence, clarity over comfort, and self-respect over approval, you reclaim your life. And in doing so, you not only protect your heart, you teach it how to heal. Shadow relationships are those deep, emotionally charged connections that often feel magnetic, confusing, or even fated, but are rooted in parts of ourselves we have not yet fully acknowledged or understood. These relationships are not inherently bad, but they are often intense and challenging because they bring forward what lies in our psychological shadow, the aspects of ourselves that we repress, deny, or disown. The shadow is not just about what is dark or negative. It can also include positive traits that we've been taught to suppress, such as assertiveness, desire, ambition, or vulnerability. When these disowned traits are projected onto another person, a powerful dynamic is formed, one that feels emotionally significant but can be deeply destabilizing. In a shadow relationship, the other person serves as a mirror, reflecting back to you the unconscious material you've been avoiding. You may be drawn to their confidence because you've denied your own. You may feel intoxicated by their chaos because part of you craves freedom from your own rigid control. You may feel an overwhelming need to fix them, not realizing you're actually trying to heal something within yourself. These relationships feel profound, even spiritual, because they touch the parts of us that normal relationships often don't. This intensity can also create confusion and suffering if the dynamics remain unconscious. Often, these relationships begin with instant chemistry or a sense of familiarity. You meet someone and feel like you've known them forever. There's a magnetic pull, a sense that this person will change your life, that something meaningful is happening. That feeling may be real, but not for the reason you think. What's happening is that your shadow has recognized itself in the other person. You might see their flaws and feel strangely attracted to them. You might overlook red flags because something deeper is being stirred, something that bypasses logic and taps directly into the emotional body. These relationships frequently trigger emotional extremes. Deep love followed by deep hurt, connection followed by rejection, elation followed by despair. This push-pull cycle is common because shadow material resists being brought to light. When one or both people begin to feel exposed or overwhelmed, they may pull away, lash out, or behave erratically. That's because the relationship is surfacing unconscious wounds, such as abandonment, shame, unworthiness, or fear of intimacy. These triggers are not signs that the relationship is fading. They are signs that the shadow is being activated. And unless both individuals are aware of what's happening, the relationship can become a battleground of projections. One common feature of shadow relationships is that they reveal the roles we unconsciously play in connection. You might always end up as the caregiver, the rescuer, the pleaser, or the victim. These roles often reflect patterns learned in childhood, ways we adapted to receive love or avoid conflict. In shadow relationships, these roles become exaggerated. You may find yourself obsessing over someone's well-being while neglecting your own. You may tolerate mistreatment because you've been taught that love must be earned. You may lose your sense of self in trying to be what the other person needs. This merging can feel romantic, but it's often a sign of emotional enmeshment where boundaries are blurred and individual identities are lost. What makes shadow relationships so powerful is their potential for transformation. If approached with awareness, they can serve as catalysts for deep inner work. The pain they cause is often the pain of self-confrontation. When someone triggers you, they are often showing you a part of yourself you have not fully integrated. If they make you feel abandoned, it may be because you have not learned how to hold yourself through loneliness. If they make you feel small, it may be because you've forgotten your own power. If they seem emotionally unavailable, it may reflect your own fear of true vulnerability. These revelations are not comfortable, but they are necessary for healing. However, the danger arises when one becomes addicted to the cycle. The highs and lows of shadow relationships can mimic the patterns of emotional addiction. The intensity becomes confused with love. The suffering becomes romanticized as part of some higher purpose. But pain, while a powerful teacher, is not proof of destiny. If a relationship continually drains you, disorients you, or makes you feel like you're losing yourself, it's not a sign that you're supposed to endure it forever. It's a sign that your shadow is screaming to be acknowledged. Bringing consciousness into a shadow relationship means taking responsibility for your projections. It means asking yourself what this person is reflecting back to you. Are they showing you your unmet needs? Are they revealing the ways you abandon yourself? Are they challenging the beliefs you hold about love, safety, or worth? These questions don't need immediate answers, but the willingness to ask them shifts the dynamic. You stop seeing the other person as the villain or the savior and begin to see them as a mirror. This reframing dissolves blame and empowers healing. Self-awareness also allows you to begin the process of integration. Integration is the act of reclaiming the disowned parts of yourself. If you've been suppressing your voice, you begin to speak. If you've been denying your need for emotional safety, you begin to honor it. If you've been chasing chaos, you begin to cultivate inner peace. As you integrate your shadow, the people and situations that once triggered you lose their grip. You no longer need someone to reflect your pain back to you because you've learned how to hold it yourself. Not all shadow relationships are meant to last. Some are meant to teach. They arrive like storms, wild, powerful, and sometimes destructive, but they clear the path for new growth. Others can evolve into healthy connections if both individuals are committed to self-awareness and healing. But regardless of the outcome, the gift of a shadow relationship is not the relationship itself. It's what it awakens within you. It forces you to look inward, to reckon with your past, to question your patterns, and ultimately to become more whole. The truth is, every relationship is to some degree a mirror, but shadow relationships are magnified mirrors. They don't just show you what's on the surface, they show you what's been buried. They ask you to feel what you've been avoiding. They challenge your self-image, your coping mechanisms, and your comfort zones. And in doing so, they offer the raw material for transformation. When you begin to understand this, the pain becomes purposeful. You no longer see yourself as a victim of love gone wrong, but as a participant in your own awakening. You begin to trust that every trigger is an invitation, every heartbreak a lesson, every emotional storm a chance to meet yourself more deeply. The relationship may or may not last, but the self-knowledge you gain remains. And in the end, that is what shadow work is about. Not fixing someone else, but reclaiming yourself. Misalignment of values is one of the most subtle yet powerful reasons relationships of all kinds begin to fracture over time. While it might be easy to assume that love, attraction, shared goals, or even history are enough to sustain a connection, values are the invisible architecture that quietly determines whether a relationship will thrive or slowly unravel. Values are the deeply held beliefs and principles that shape how we see the world, make decisions, and interact with others. They are not just opinions or preferences, they are core to who we are, influencing everything from how we handle conflict to what we prioritize in life. When two people enter a relationship, whether romantic, platonic, or professional, there's often a focus on compatibility at the surface level. Shared interests, chemistry, mutual admiration, or aligned life goals. But what's less obvious, and often ignored in the honeymoon phase, is whether their values align. You can both want marriage, children, success, or adventure, but if your definitions of those things are rooted in different value systems, conflict will eventually arise. One person may see family as a sacred commitment built on loyalty and tradition, while the other sees it as a fluid structure rooted in personal freedom. Personal freedom. One may value honesty above harmony, while the other believes in maintaining peace at all. These differences don't always reveal themselves immediately, but when they do, they tend to shake the foundation of the relationship. Misalignment doesn't always mean one person is wrong, the other is right. It simply means that each person is operating from a different internal compass. The conflict arises when one or both parties attempt to override or suppress their values to maintain the connection. This often leads to internal resentment, emotional burnout, or an identity crisis. When you compromise on a value, you're not just adjusting a preference, you're sacrificing a piece of yourself. Over time, this self-abandonment erodes trust both in the relationship and within yourself. The pull of love, desire, or belonging can be strong enough to make us ignore red flags. You may tell yourself that certain issues are minor, that the other person will change, or that love will reach them. Sometimes you might not even be fully aware of your own values because you've never been challenged to articulate or defend them. It's often through conflict or unmet expectations that your values rise to the... When someone crosses a line you didn't even realize was there, that's when you discover how important that value truly is to you. One of the most common areas where value misalignment shows up is in communication. If one person values directness and transparency while the other avoids confrontation and prefers subtlety, misunderstandings will be frequent. One may interpret the other as aggressive, while the other sees avoidance as dishonest. These perceptions lead to recurring conflict not just over behavior, but over the meaning behind that behavior. It's not just about what was said or done. It's about what each person believes is right, respectful, or loved. Another area where value differences become glaring is in how people handle boundaries. If one person believes in strict personal boundaries as a form of self-respect, and the other believes love means full access and constant availability, tension will arise. One person will feel smothered, while the other feels rejected. These differences often become more pronounced in times of stress, transition, or crisis. When people are under pressure, they revert to their core values and coping mechanisms. And if those mechanisms are fundamentally incompatible, the relationship begins to crack. Money, religion, parent styles, career ambitions, social issues, and even lifestyle choices can all be battlegrounds for misaligned values. For example, two people might both value success, but one defines it as wealth and status, while the other defines it as impact and integrity. These distinctions matter. You may both value freedom, but one sees it as emotional independence, and the other as the ability to travel and take risks. Without clarity and mutual understanding, these differences lead to confusion, unmet expectations, and eventually disillusionment. In many relationships, one person ends up bending their values repeatedly in order to preserve the connection. They rationalize, downplay their discomfort, or convince themselves that love means sacrifice. But this form of emotional suppression is not sustainable. It builds resentment like a slow, steady leak. Eventually, it becomes impossible to hide. The person who has been suppressing their values begins to pull away, shut down, or even lash out. They may not even fully understand why they feel so tired, angry, or unfulfilled. But deep down, it's because they've been living out of alignment with who they truly are. What makes value misalignment especially painful is that it often comes to light after emotional bonds have been formed. You may love someone deeply and still realize that your values are in conflict. This realization creates an emotional crossroads. Do you stay and keep compromising yourself, or do you walk away from someone you love for the sake of your truth? These are not easy decisions. They require maturity, self-awareness, and the courage to grieve what could have been. It's tempting to try to affix the other person or convince them to adopt your values, but this usually leads to power struggles, manipulation, or emotional distance. Healthy relationships are not just about shared feelings, they're about shared frameworks. When values align, conflicts can still happen, but the resolution is rooted in mutual respect and understanding. There's a shared language, a shared sense of what matters. You may disagree on the surface, but your underlying principles guide you back to common ground. When values are misaligned, however, even small issues can feel like existential threats. Every disagreement feels like a challenge to your identity, and every compromise feels like a loss of integrity. Learning to recognize value misalignment requires honesty and emotional courage. It means being willing to name your values, even if they seem inconvenient or unpopular. It means asking questions early in relationships, paying attention to how people live, not just what they say. It means observing how someone treats others, how they respond to pressure, and whether their actions align with their stated beliefs. These observations give you clues, not just about who they are, but about whether your worlds can truly coexist without one of you shrinking. Ultimately, relationships thrive when there is both emotional connection and value alignment. One without the other creates imbalance. Emotional connection without value alignment feels passionate, but unstable. Value alignment without emotional connection feels safe but rare. The sweet spot is where both exist. A relationship where you feel deeply seen and also deeply respected. where you can disagree without feeling threatened, where compromise is mutual, not sacrificial, and where love is not a battle between two worldviews, but a bridge between two souls who are walking in the same direction. Fear of confrontation is a deeply ingrained emotional pattern that affects how people communicate, make decisions, and navigate relationships. It is rooted not just in a dislike for conflict, but in a much deeper discomfort with vulnerability, rejection, and loss of control. For many, confrontation is associated with danger, either emotional, psychological, or even physical. This belief often stems from past experiences where expressing needs or setting boundaries was met with punishment, abandonment, or ridicule. As a result, avoiding confrontation becomes a protective mechanism, an attempt to preserve connection or maintain peace at the cost. People who fear confrontation often internalize the idea that bringing up a problem will lead to escalation, not resolution. They imagine worst-case scenarios where the other person becomes angry, dismissive, or leaves altogether. This fear distorts their ability to speak truthfully, even about small issues. Instead of saying what they feel or asking for what they need, they stay silent, hoping the problem will resolve on its own or that their feelings will eventually fade. But feelings rarely dissolve in silence. They tend to grow louder, turning into resentment, anxiety, or emotional distance. This avoidance creates a false sense of peace. On the surface, everything might appear calm and functional, but underneath there is a growing disconnection. One person might feel unseen, unheard, or taken for granted, while the other remains unaware that anything is wrong. This lack of communication erodes intimacy over time. Emotional closeness is built through honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. When that honesty is missing, people begin to drift apart, not because of what is said, but because of what is left unsaid. The fear of confrontation can also cause people to betray themselves. They may agree to things they don't want, stay in situations that hurt them, or tolerate behavior that violates their values. Every time they avoid a difficult conversation, they reinforce the belief that their needs don't matter, or that keeping others comfortable is more important than being true to themselves. This self-abandonment may initially feel like kindness or compromise, but it eventually becomes a quiet form of self-erasure. Over time, it damages self-esteem and leads to a loss of identity. In relationships, this fear often manifests as passive communication. Instead of directly expressing concerns, people hint, withdraw, or use sarcasm. These indirect forms of expression rarely produce clarity. Instead, they create confusion and misinterpretation. The other person may not understand what is really wrong, or worse, they may begin to sense that something is off, but feel powerless to fix it. Without open dialogue, the relationship becomes a guessing game, full of assumptions and emotional minefield. The irony is that avoiding confrontation rarely prevents conflict, it just delays it. Unspoken issues have a way of surfacing eventually, often in more dramatic and damaging ways. A small annoyance that could have been addressed calmly turns into an explosion after months of suppression. A boundary that was never expressed becomes a source of deep hurt when it is finally enforced abruptly. This delayed reaction creates more pain than the initial confrontation would have, and it reinforces the original fear, making the person even less likely to speak up in the future. One of the most common justifications for avoiding confrontation is the belief that it will hurt the other person. People who fear confrontation often see themselves as empathetic or peace-loving, and they don't want to be the cause of someone else's discomfort. But this belief overlooks a crucial truth. Protecting others from discomfort is not the same as protecting the relationship. In fact, avoiding hard conversations often causes more harm than good. When people are not given the chance to hear the truth or understand your needs, they are denied the opportunity to grow, adjust, or repair. There's also a significant link between fear of confrontation and perfectionism. Some individuals believe that in order to be loved, they must be agreeable, likable, or flawless. They equate confrontation with failure, as if having a problem or needing to speak up means the relationship is broken or they are not good enough. This mindset creates immense internal pressure to maintain appearances and keep everyone happy, even when it means suppressing real concerns. But emotional honesty is not a flaw. It's a strength. It requires more courage to speak difficult truths than to remain silent in fear. Developing the ability to confront takes time, and it starts with redefining what confrontation actually means. It is not inherently aggressive, hostile, or divisive. At its core, confrontation is simply the act of facing something directly. It's about choosing clarity over comfort, truth over pretense. Healthy confrontation is rooted in respect. It's about saying, "This matters enough to talk about, not you're wrong, and I'm right." It's an invitation to repair, not a demand to win. When done with care and intention, confrontation deepens understanding and builds trust. To overcome the fear of confrontation, self-awareness is key. Start by noticing the moments when you feel discomfort rising in your body, the tightening of your chest, the urge to avoid eye contact, the sudden silence. These physical cues are often signals that something needs to be expressed. Instead of immediately pushing those feelings down, pause and ask yourself what you're afraid of. Are you worried about being misunderstood, rejected, losing the relationship? These fears are valid, but they should not have the final say in how you show up. It also helps to reframe confrontation as a form of self-care and relational care. Speaking up is not just about getting your way. It's about honoring your truth and giving others a chance to truly know you. It's about creating relationships that are based on honesty, not illusion. And it's about trusting that the people who belong in your life will not abandon you for being real. In fact, those who truly value you will welcome your honesty even when it's hard to hear. Practice is essential. Start small. Express a preference, say no when something doesn't feel right, or voice a minor concern without apologizing for it. These small acts build emotional muscle. With each successful confrontation, you prove to yourself that you can survive discomfort. You learn that your world doesn't collapse when you express your truth. You start to realize that confrontation isn't the enemy. Avoidance is. Ultimately, fear of confrontation is not a flaw to be ashamed of. It's a protective strategy, often rooted in past wounds. But as you grow, you begin to see that protection is not the same as peace. Real peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of truth. When you begin to trust your voice, when you stop running from discomfort, you create a life that is aligned, empowered, and rooted in authenticity. And from that place, connection becomes not just safer, but deeper. Dependency and self-abandonment often operate together in quiet, unconscious ways, shaping the way people engage in relationships, make decisions, and perceive their own worth. In its most basic form, is not inherently negative. Humans are wired for connection and interdependence. We all need support, affection, validation, and companionship. However, when dependency evolves into an emotional reliance that substitutes someone else's presence, approval, or care for our own inner sense of stability, it begins to create imbalance. This is where self-abandonment enters. The moment we begin to silence our needs, ignore our truth, or betray ourselves in order to preserve a relationship or maintain someone's love. People who develop strong patterns of dependency often have a history of emotional neglect, inconsistency, or invalidation. They may have learned early on that love is conditional, that their needs are inconvenient, or that being themselves risks abandonment. As a result, they begin to externalize their sense of self-worth. Instead of cultivating inner security, they look outward to a partner, a friend, a parent, or even a mentor to feel okay. Their sense of safety, value, and identity becomes tied to how someone else sees them or treats them. This dependency creates a fragile emotional ecosystem where the fear of loss governs behavior more than authenticity does.